was really smart, or a better parent, I wouldn't let my kids read the Bible. At least not all of it. And actually, who am I kidding? In today's day and age, they aren't going to read the Bible. But they might watch it on the big screen. So even so, if that were the case, if I were a good parent, I'd fast forward through parts. I'd make them cover their eyes, and I would most certainly mute some verbal exchanges that go on in the Bible. Because the Bible is filled with murder and mayhem and hunger and oppression and sex and violence. And we don't often think of the Bible, the holy word of God, the narrative of God, in this manner. We prefer to focus on the miraculous healings and the incomparable compassion of Jesus Christ. We prefer to see ourselves as struggling, yet dutiful disciples. However, life is as much rated R as it is rated G. And the Bible isn't any different. The Motion Picture Association would have a field day with the Bible. Well, over the next 9 months, we're going to view the narrative of the Bible differently. So instead, as you felt this morning, instead of 3 readings which relate to one another thematically, we're going to start at the beginning, in Genesis, and move sort of chronologically through the Bible, through our story with God. And we're going to walk and struggle with the people that we meet along the way. And it's going to feel a bit different, since we'll predominantly have one reading, and the thing that's going to feel the most different is here in the beginning of the Bible, Jesus isn't on the scene yet. And the other challenge we're going to have is setting aside our preconceived notions that we already know what this story is about, which is actually the biggest challenge we face today with Adam and Eve. Because we've all heard this story since we were old enough to sit at our Sunday school teacher's knees. So the brief synopsis of Adam and Eve is, they're in the Garden of Eden for a bit, and everything is going along swimmingly. And then along comes the nasty snake that tricks Eve into eating the bad apple, which she in turn convinces Adam to eat. And it's all downhill from there. And as some would say, we've been trying to get back into the Garden of Eden ever since. Well, I have a question for you, which I actually think is a question that you all wonder about this story. Why? Why put this tree in the middle of the garden in the first place? Why in the world does God put the snake in the garden in the first place? I mean, is God setting us up for failure? Some big test? Are we destined from the very beginning to fall? Because I certainly think that God could have thought this whole plan through a little bit better. Okay, well, I said that I'd like us to try to think about things a bit more broadly, especially as this is the first story that we're encountering as we go through this whole epic narration. So first, let's talk about the snake. What do we know, or what do we think we know about the snake? So we've grown up that the snake is very bad. He has evil interests at heart. You know the snake's first name, is Satan, and here in Genesis he goes by his last name, snake or serpent. I'm joking. It's a big laugh. I don't actually know that. I'm wondering where it actually says that in the Bible. That he's bad, that he's evil, up to no good. Is it true that being described as crafty means that the something or someone is inherently bad? Because I don't think that's always true. Because the same Hebrew word that we translate here as crafty is translated elsewhere in Proverbs and other places in the Bible as prudent or sensible. So I know this is going to push it a bit, but maybe the snake's just being logical. And if that's the case, what's he being logical about? What is the snake's perspective? Because the snake already knew there was evil out there. Already knew that danger and darkness existed. We just didn't know it. We were blind to it. We hadn't been exposed to it. So I can't help but wonder how or why the snake knew. So I came up with 3 answers. There may be more. But first, the snake could have already eaten of the tree of good and evil. And if that's the case, God still let the snake stay in the garden. Second, maybe God made the snake that way, to know about good and evil. So if that's the case, God cared about the snake enough to make the snake that way. Or third, the snake came from someplace beyond Eden, where the snake had seen good and bad. So I actually like the third option the best, although I have 0 textual support for this. I'm just telling you it's my personal favorite. But the reason it makes the most sense to me is it provides a reason for the snake's craftiness. But the answer to the question, how the snake know, doesn't really matter. What matters is regardless of how the snake knew about evil, he knew about it. That's all we need to know. And the snake made sure that we knew about it too. Adam and Eve could recognize good. The fruit was good. It says so in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, it says that the fruit that they ate was good for food. And apparently it was also not good. Good and bad both in the same object. Crafty can be good and bad. The tree in the garden, good and bad. Words. The snake used words for bad, and God used words for good. Creation grows good and bad. Sex can be used for good and bad. And shame exhibited as good and bad. The snake knew that if Adam and Eve knew there was more beyond the Garden of Eden, that they might be able to plant and till some other things. And the snake would be right. The question was, what would we plant? Good or bad? Love or hate? Light or dark? So, does the snake actually do good or bad? Or both? See, until this point, however long this point in time existed, maybe it was a moment, Maybe they were only there for a moment. Maybe it was years. Maybe it was eons. Until that point, humanity only knew that good existed. And that's lovely. Really, really lovely. And it wasn't true. At least it wasn't the whole story. Because this is a real story. Maybe not in the literal sense, that there was one guy named Adam and one lady named Eve that lived in a lush, perfect garden. No, this is a real story in the sense that God never, ever says that it was perfect. Perfect means the story's done. Perfect means complete. Perfect means there's no more room for growth or change. The Garden of Eden wasn't everything there was. It wasn't the whole of creation. Because see, I think the truest thing that happened that day in the Garden of Eden was that Adam and Eve realized that very, very good, pure things can be used for evil. And that's a bit heartbreaking. But the promise is ingenious. It's one that should make us stand back and say, what just happened? God took the bad that Adam and Eve learned and turned it into another tool. Somewhere along the way, we've heard this story as punishment rather than promise. Because ever since that day, Adam and Eve, you and me, we've been learning that God can and does use things that we might deem evil or wrong, like slithering, lowly snakes, to bring about good and right. Ever since the moment we encountered the snake. That thing that shook our understanding of the way the world was set into orbit. The thing that stripped us of our innocence and made us realize that we were naked. God's been seeing to the promise of this story, that sometimes the most amazing things can come from terrible lies. Not long ago, I made a joke to a friend, which at the time I did not realize the theological truths of it. But I said, Lucifer makes me flirt shamelessly with Voldemort. The question today is what the flirting brings about. The truth of the matter is in the garden, we learned that we can flirt with sex and it can be good, and it can be love. Or we can wield it as power, and it can be used for bad. And we learned that we can use words to bring about goodness and build relationships. Or we can lie and sever ties. We learned in the garden that we can let things grow, or we can hoard food and resources. The question is, do we use what we've learned in the Garden of Eden shamelessly, or for shame outside of the garden? So maybe the reason they got sent out of the Garden of Eden was to grow the garden. We aren't the snake, and we aren't God, and we aren't angels, and we aren't wild creatures. We are Adam and Eve, sent to till and sow the garden. There is one lie that the snake does actually do in this whole story. The snake says, we won't die. And when they tasted the fruit and thought they didn't die, they probably believed in the snake more than they believed in God. until they realize that dying looks very differently to snakes than it does to God. They died. God saw to it. They died to their old way of living. Everything was different out here east of Eden. God gave them a new life. And they learned that they really do have to till the earth to keep things living. They learned that with God, dead isn't dead. It's a chance for resurrection. And the snake didn't know that. And I think that's what God taught the snake through Adam and Eve. And still today teaches snakes. Dead is never dead. And bad is never all bad. The goodness of God will seek always to sow more goodness in and out of the garden. So that at some point, there is no getting back into Eden. Because east of Eden has become just as much of a fruitful garden as Eden.